They called them lungers. 20,000 a year, packed into train cars heading west, coughing blood into handkerchiefs, racing the disease that was killing them. By 1900, 1 in 3 people living in Colorado had come there to die. Not for gold, not for land, not for the frontier. They came because their doctors had told them the truth. Go west, or go to your grave. Denver became the largest tuberculosis camp in the world, and it changed everything. The city, the state, the very idea of what the American West was for. Welcome to the Sanatorium. Tonight we're travelling to the American West, to a mile-high city built on hope and desperation, where the dying came by the trainload seeking a cure that no medicine could provide. A city whose very identity was shaped by tuberculosis. If you're new here, this channel explores how tuberculosis, the disease that killed 1 in 4 people in the 19th century, shaped everything from architecture to art, from fashion to the American West. If that sounds like your kind of history, consider subscribing. Now, settle in, find a comfortable position, let your breathing slow. We have a long journey ahead, through frontier towns and tent colonies, through luxury sanatoria and sleeping porches, through the story of how disease built a state. Let's begin. Imagine, if you will, a train car rolling westward across the Great Plains. It is the summer of 1892, and this particular car is different from the others. The windows are thrown open despite the dust. The passengers sit apart from one another when they can, and every few minutes someone coughs, a deep, rattling cough that seems to come from somewhere far beneath the lungs. Many of these passengers carry one-way tickets. They have sold their homes back east, said goodbye to families they may never see again, and put everything they own into the hope that the air of Colorado will save their lives. Some have money, enough for the luxury sanatoria that advertise in the eastern newspapers, promising sun-drenched terraces and fresh mountain air. Others have almost nothing, just enough for the train ticket and perhaps a week's lodging, after which they will figure something out somehow, or die trying. The mountains appear on the horizon, rising blue and distant above the brown plain. Snow gleams on the highest peaks even in summer. And somewhere ahead, still hours away, lies Denver, the mile-high city, the world's sanatorium, the last best hope for thousands of the dying. They have heard the promises. The air is pure, the sunshine is constant, the altitude itself has healing properties. Eastern doctors have told them to go west or die. And so they come, 20,000 a year by some estimates, filling entire train cars with their coughs and their hopes. This is their story. To understand why so many desperate people converged on Colorado, we must first understand what tuberculosis meant in 19th century America. In the crowded cities of the eastern seaboard, tuberculosis was everywhere. It was the leading cause of death in the United States, killing more people than any other disease. Entire tenement buildings were infected. Families watched helplessly as one member after another fell ill, wasted away, and died. The disease was called consumption because of the way it seemed to consume its victims from within. The cough, the fever, the blood in the handkerchief, the slow wasting away of flesh until the patient was little more than bones and skin. And always, always, the cough. Persistent, unstoppable, a constant reminder that the lungs were filling with disease. In the tenements of New York, families lived 6 or 8 to a room, breathing the same stale air, sharing beds, unable to isolate the sick from the healthy. The disease spread through families like fire through dry timber. A mother would catch it from her husband, then pass it to her children. By the time one generation was buried, the next was already coughing. The numbers were staggering. In 1850, tuberculosis killed more than 400 people per 100,000 in the United States. In the crowded immigrant neighbourhoods of the eastern cities, the rate was even higher. Some tenements became so infected that landlords could not rent the rooms, not because tenants feared the disease, but because they had already seen what happened to the previous occupants. There was no cure, no effective treatment. Doctors could offer rest, good food, perhaps some morphine to ease the coughing, but they knew, and their patients knew, that these were palliative measures at best. The best they could hope for was to make the patient comfortable as the disease ran its inexorable course. Some physicians experimented with radical treatments. Bloodletting was still practiced, though it was beginning to fall out of favour. Cod liver oil was prescribed, as were tonics containing various combinations of alcohol and herbs. Some doctors punctured the chest cavity to collapse the lung, hoping that rest would allow the damaged tissue to heal. None of these treatments worked consistently. Most did more harm than good. The wealthy could flee to the countryside, to the mountains, to any place where the air was cleaner and the disease less prevalent. They could afford sanatoria in the Swiss Alps, where patients lounged on balconies wrapped in blankets, breathing the thin mountain air. But the poor had no such option. They stayed in the tenements, coughing into the darkness, waiting for the end that they knew was coming. And yet some doctors had noticed something peculiar. Patients who moved from the humid, crowded cities to drier, higher climates sometimes improved. The cough lessened. The fever subsided. Some patients who had been given weeks to live survived for years. A theory emerged. Perhaps the problem was not just the disease itself, but the environment in which the disease flourished. Perhaps the humid air of the cities, thick with coal smoke and factory fumes, and the exhalations of thousands of crowded inhabitants was the real enemy. Perhaps what the consumptive needed was fresh air, dry air, pure air. And where in America was the air purest? Where was it driest? Where did the sun shine more than 300 days a year? Where could patients escape the coal smoke and the humidity and the crowded conditions that seemed to make the disease spread so quickly? Colorado. The answer seemed obvious. Colorado's altitude, a mile above sea level in Denver, even higher in the mountain towns, meant thin, dry air. The lack of humidity meant fewer of the damp conditions in which disease seemed to flourish. The endless sunshine meant patients could spend hours outdoors, breathing the clean mountain air, soaking up the healing rays of the sun. The Colorado Chamber of Commerce was not slow to recognize the opportunity. Advertisements appeared in eastern newspapers proclaiming the state's miraculous climate. The air was 100% aseptic, the boosters claimed. The altitude, more than a mile above sea level, was itself therapeutic. The constant sunshine bathed patients in healing light. For families watching loved ones die, these promises were irresistible. What did they have to lose? If they stayed in the east, death was certain. But if they went west, if they reached Colorado, perhaps there was a chance. And so the migration began. By 1880, Denver had earned the nickname the World Sanatorium. By 1900, 1/3 of Colorado's entire population had moved there because of tuberculosis. It was, in a sense, the largest health-related migration in American history. The story of Colorado as a tuberculosis destination begins with the Civil War hero and railroad tycoon named William Jackson Palmer. Palmer was born in Delaware in 1836 to a Quaker family. During the Civil War, he distinguished himself as a cavalry officer, rising to the rank of Brevet Brigadier General and receiving the Medal of Honor for his actions. He was, by any measure, a man of exceptional ability and ambition. After the war, Palmer turned his attention to railroads, the great engine of American expansion. He came to the Colorado Territory in the late 1860s as a surveyor for the Kansas Pacific Railway, seeking possible routes through the mountains. He was accompanied by an English physician named William Abraham Bell. Together they saw something in this rugged territory that others had missed. It was not just the mineral wealth, though there was plenty of that. It was not just the scenic beauty, though the mountains were spectacular. It was the air itself, thin, dry, crystal clear. The kind of air that doctors back east were beginning to prescribe for their consumptive patients. On July 31st, 1871, Palmer and Bell founded a new town at the base of Pikes Peak. They called it Fountain Colony, later renamed Colorado Springs, and from the beginning, Palmer envisioned it as something more than an ordinary frontier settlement. He wanted to build a health resort, a place where the sick could come to heal, a destination that would attract not just settlers and miners, but invalids with money to spend. Palmer understood that the railroad could carry more than freight and settlers. It could carry the sick, the wealthy sick in particular, who would pay handsomely for the chance to recover in the mountain air. His Denver and Rio Grande Railway would be the artery through which this new industry would flow. The first section of the railway opened in 1871, running south from Denver across the Palmer Divide to Colorado Springs. It was the first narrow-gauge railroad in the West, an engineering achievement that opened the mountains to commerce and, crucially, to patients. The plan worked beyond his dreams. By 1880, tuberculosis patients were arriving in Colorado Springs by the hundreds. By 1900, the town was known as the City of Sunshine and America's Playground, one of the most popular health destinations in the United States. More than 15 sanatoria operated in the region. Palmer poured millions of his own money into the community. He donated over 1,600 acres for parks, hospitals, and schools. He gave land for Colorado College, for the Colorado School for the Deaf and Blind, for several churches in the downtown area. He funded the Cragmore Sanatorium, a facility for tuberculosis treatment that would become one of the most famous in the nation. The houses along North Nevada Avenue were converted into boarding houses for consumptives. The large homes on the old North End built sleeping porches for their consumptive boarders. The area became known locally as Lunger's Row. Palmer shaped the very landscape of the city around, the needs of the health-seeking population. When he died in 1909, from injuries sustained in a horse-riding accident, not from disease, William Jackson Palmer left behind not just a railroad empire, but a city whose identity had been forged by tuberculosis. His legacy endures. The narrow-gauge railway he built still runs through the mountains. The college he founded still educates students, and the sanatorium he funded, Cragmore, eventually became the University of Colorado Springs. The man who saw health in the mountain air built a city to prove it. The term was not kind, but it was widely used. Lungers. That's what the locals called the tuberculosis patients, who poured off the trains by the thousands. They came from everywhere, from the tenements of New York and the row houses of Philadelphia, from the mill towns of New England and the crowded neighborhoods of Chicago. They came with letters of recommendation from their Eastern doctors. They came with newspaper clippings promising miracle cures. They came with everything they owned packed into a single trunk. And they came in all conditions. Some arrived in the early stages of the disease when the prognosis was still uncertain. These patients had the best chance of benefiting from the mountain air. With rest and good food and years of careful living, some of them would recover, or at least survive far longer than they would have in the East. But others arrived in the final stages of consumption. They came on stretchers too weak to walk. They came with hollow eyes and skeletal frames, coughing blood into stained handkerchiefs. For these patients, Colorado was not really a cure. It was a place to die in sunshine rather than in shadow. The quality of care depended entirely on one's ability to pay. The wealthy could afford the luxury sanatoria that charged $50 a week, enormous sums at the time. These institutions offered private rooms, special diets, live orchestras, and the attentive care of trained nurses. The middle class might find placement in more modest facilities at $7 per week, adequate care if not luxurious. But the poor, and many of the Lungas were poor, having spent their last savings on the train ticket west, had few options. Some ended up in tent colonies, rows of canvas shelters erected on wooden platforms at the edges of towns. They lived exposed to the elements, wrapped in blankets, hoping that the open air would heal what medicine could not. Others had nothing at all. They slept in parks, they begged on street corners, they filled the jails of Denver, not because they had committed crimes, but because the authorities had nowhere else to put them. At the opposite end of the spectrum stood places like Cragmore. Founded in 1906 by Dr. Edwin S. Solly, Cragmore Sanatorium was designed from the ground up to cater to the wealthy consumptive. Located in the Austin Bluffs north of Colorado Springs, an area that came to be called Cragmore, it offered spectacular views of the Rocky Mountains and an atmosphere of refined luxury. Dr. Solly's dream was ambitious, to build a first-rate sanatorium for wealthy Lungas. He designed wide windows for every room, a sunroof to allow patients maximum time in fresh air and sunlight, and excellent food prepared by skilled cooks. General William Jackson Palmer donated funds toward the initial construction. The sanatorium's director, Dr. Alexius Forster, articulated the philosophy to create an atmosphere of happiness and cheerfulness. At Cragmore, the emphasis was not merely on physical treatment, but on maintaining the patient's spirits through a pleasant social environment. And pleasant it was. Cragmore became known as the most luxurious palace for well-to-do consumptives in the United States. Millionaires, musicians, artists, dancers and poets came to take the cure. The patients came from the main line of Philadelphia, from Boston, from New York, from the great centers of American culture and wealth. Constance Pulitzer, daughter of the newspaper magnate Joseph Pulitzer, spent time there. Broadway performers convalesced in its sun-drenched rooms. The sanatorium attracted a gregarious, cultured clientele who refused to let their illness dampen their spirits. The patients even published their own journal, which they called 98.6, a reference to the ideal body temperature to which they all aspired. The journal contained poems, essays, and humour, all produced by people who knew they might be dead within the year. It was in its way a monument to human resilience, or perhaps to human denial. The architecture itself was designed around the cure. Wide windows flooded every room with light. Sun porches allowed patients to recline for hours, breathing the mountain air while gazing at the peaks. The social calendar included parties, dances, and entertainments, though the patients were encouraged to rest between engagements. The atmosphere was, by all accounts, more like a resort than a hospital. There were romances between patients, affairs conducted in the shadow of death. People who might have only months to live found themselves attending dinner parties and afternoon teas, dancing with partners who were as sick as themselves. It was, in its way, a kind of denial, a refusal to surrender to the disease that was consuming them. If one was going to die, one might as well die in pleasant surroundings, surrounded by good company with champagne in one's glass. Cragmore thrived for 2 decades. The money flowed in, the patients kept coming. And then came October 1929. The stock market crash devastated Cragmore's clientele. The wealthy patients who had filled its rooms found themselves suddenly impoverished. Fortunes built over generations vanished in weeks, and the sanatorium, which depended on those fortunes, found its revenue collapsing. Some patients were forcibly removed when they could no longer pay their bills. Imagine it. Men and women who had come to Colorado expecting either to recover or to die in comfort, suddenly expelled from the sanatorium because their money had evaporated in the crash. They had nothing. No health, no wealth, no home. A few, devastated by their financial losses and their failing health, took their own lives. The sanatorium that had promised happiness and cheerfulness became, for some, a scene of despair. Cragmore struggled on through the Great Depression. It began accepting middle-class and working-class patients at reduced rates, $7 a week instead of $50. The parties grew quieter, the champagne disappeared, the atmosphere of refined luxury gave way to something more modest, more desperate. By the late 1940s, the sanatorium was bankrupt. It seemed destined to close, another casualty of the antibiotics that were making such institutions obsolete. Then came an unexpected reprieve. The federal government made an offer. It would financially support the sanatorium if Cragmore would accept tuberculosis-infected Navajo tribal members from Arizona and New Mexico. The director signed the contract, and in the early 1950s, Navajo patients were transported to Cragmore for care. It was a strange final chapter. The sanatorium that had catered to the wealthiest Americans now served some of the poorest, Native Americans whose communities had been ravaged by tuberculosis, often spread by contact with white settlers. In 1964, Cragmore was sold to the University of Colorado system. The sanatorium became a campus. Today, two of its former buildings, Cragmore Hall and Main Hall, house students at the University of Colorado Springs. The sun porches where dying millionaires once reclined are now classrooms. The dining room where champagne toasts were raised to uncertain futures now hosts academic conferences. Archaeologists from the university have recently begun excavating the grounds, finding artifacts from the sanatorium era, medicine bottles, patient belongings, fragments of a vanished world. They are digging up history in the shadow of Pikes Peak. But what of those lungers who arrived in Colorado with nothing? What of the thousands who spent their last dollars on train tickets, only to find themselves homeless and dying in a strange city? One woman saw their suffering and refused to accept it. Frances Weisbart Jacobs was born in Kentucky in 1843 and moved to Denver with her husband in 1863, when the city was barely 4 years old. She became known as Denver's Mother of Charities, a title she earned through decades of tireless work on behalf of the poor. As part of her charitable work, Jacobs regularly visited impoverished homes to bring food, coal, clothing, and soap. She was not afraid to touch an emaciated body. She did not flinch at the sight of blood. She often stopped to give aid to someone who had fallen on the street from a hemorrhage, a common occurrence in a city filled with consumptives. She watched as tuberculosis patients flooded into Denver, overwhelming its resources. By 1890, some 30,000 people were arriving in Colorado each year seeking the cure. Many had nothing. They had sold everything to buy their train tickets, and when they arrived, they found that no institution in Denver would admit penniless consumptives. They slept in the streets. They begged for food. They coughed in the public parks. Many of them ended up in jail, not because they had committed crimes, but because the authorities had nowhere else to put them. They lived and died on the city's streets, and Jacobs saw it all. She determined to do something about it. Jacobs launched a relentless campaign to arouse public awareness on behalf of the indigent consumptives. She sought the support of business people and political leaders. She found an ally in a young rabbi named William Stern Friedman, who shared her vision of a hospital that would serve the poor regardless of their religion. On April 8, 1890, articles of incorporation for the Jewish Hospital Association of Colorado were filed. The association bought land east of the city, and on October 9, 1892, the cornerstone of the hospital was laid. Just a month after construction began, tragedy struck. Frances Weisbart Jacobs fell ill with pneumonia. In November of 1892, she died. She was 49 years old. The hospital was named in her honour, but she never saw it open. The building sat completed but vacant for 6 years. First because of the devastating silver crisis of 1893, which collapsed Colorado's economy, and then because of continued fundraising difficulties. Finally, with assistance from the International Order of B'nai B'rith, a Jewish-led service organisation, the hospital found the funds it needed. On December 10, 1899, the National Jewish Hospital for Treatment of Consumptives admitted its first patients. The hospital adopted a remarkable motto: "None may enter who can pay, none can pay who enter." Think about that. It was the first facility in Colorado, perhaps in the country, to treat impoverished tuberculosis patients completely free of charge. If you had money, you were turned away. If you had insurance, you were sent elsewhere. Only the truly destitute could enter. The hospital was funded entirely by donations from across the country. Jewish communities in particular supported it, though the institution served patients of all religions and ethnicities. It was a monument to the principle that medical care should not depend on ability to pay. The treatment was similar to other sanatoria of the era: fresh air, plenty of food, moderate exercise, and close supervision of every aspect of patients' lives. But what made National Jewish unique was its mission: to serve those whom society had abandoned, the dying poor who had come west with nothing but hope. For nearly 70 years, until 1968, the institution admitted only patients who could not afford to pay. All care was provided free of charge. The policy ended only when Medicare and Medicaid created new funding mechanisms for the poor. Today, more than 125 years later, the institution continues to operate as National Jewish Health. It is now a leading research and treatment centre for respiratory diseases, heart disease, and immune disorders. It has been ranked the #1 respiratory hospital in the United States for many years running. The free treatment policy has long since ended, but the hospital's commitment to respiratory care, born in the tuberculosis era, born from the vision of a woman who would not accept that the poor should die in the streets, remains. Frances Weisbart Jacobs never saw her dream realised, but her dream saved thousands of lives. Among the thousands of lungers who came to Colorado, one stands out in American legend. John Henry Holliday was born in Griffin, Georgia, on August 14, 1851, into a prosperous Southern family. His father was a druggist and sometime soldier. His mother, Alice Jane, was by all accounts a refined woman who instilled in her son a love of literature and music. When Holliday was 15 years old, his mother died of tuberculosis. He watched her waste away, watched the disease consume her from within. He could not have known then that the same fate awaited him. Holliday was educated, cultured, and ambitious. At 20 years old, he graduated from the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery in Philadelphia, one of the finest dental schools in the country. He returned to the South to establish a practice, first in Atlanta, then in Griffin. He was, by all appearances, destined for a respectable life as a Southern professional. But shortly after opening his practice, Holliday developed a persistent cough. He knew what that cough meant. He had heard it before in his mother's bedroom in the months before she died. The doctors confirmed his fears. tuberculosis. The same disease that had killed his mother had found him. He was given, at most, a few months to live, perhaps longer if he sought a drier climate. The prescription was familiar to anyone who had studied medicine in those years. Go west, seek the dry air of the desert, the thin atmosphere of the mountains. Perhaps, just perhaps, the change of climate might slow the disease. And so John Henry Holliday, D.S., packed his bags and headed west. He was 22 years old and he expected to die. Holliday moved his practice to Dallas, Texas, hoping the drier climate might help. It didn't. The cough followed him, and so did the customers, or rather, the lack of them. Patients in frontier Texas were reluctant to sit in a dentist's chair while the dentist coughed blood onto their open mouths. His practice failed. He needed income. And on the frontier there was one profession that didn't mind if you coughed: gambling. Somewhere in those years, in the saloons of Dallas and Denison, in the cattle towns of Kansas, John Henry Holliday transformed. The cultured southern dentist became something else entirely. A gambler, a drinker, and increasingly a man with a reputation for violence. He drifted through the frontier towns, Cheyenne, Denver, Dodge City, Las Vegas, in the New Mexico territory. He played faro and poker in smoke-filled saloons. He got into fights. He was arrested repeatedly for gambling and for violence. The disease was killing him slowly, and he seemed determined to live as recklessly as possible in whatever time remained. The whiskey helped with the cough, or at least dulled the awareness of it. Holliday drank heavily, a practice that surely hastened the progress of the disease, but he was dying anyway. What did it matter if he died a few months sooner, so long as those months were lived on his own terms? It was in this period that he acquired the nickname that would follow him into legend. Doc, not for his dental training, but because even hardened frontier gamblers could see that this thin, coughing man was a sick man, a dying man. In 1879, in Dodge City, Kansas, Doc Holliday met a lawman named Wyatt Earp. The two men formed an unlikely friendship, the dying gambler and the austere peace officer. It was a friendship that would lead them both to Tombstone, Arizona, and to immortality. By the time he arrived in Tombstone, Arizona in 1880, Doc Holliday was infamous. His reputation preceded him, a dangerous man, quick with a gun, unpredictable when drinking, and always coughing. Tombstone was a boom town, built on silver mining and populated by the usual frontier mix of miners, merchants, prostitutes, and outlaws. Wyatt Earp had come there to enforce the law, along with his brothers Virgil and Morgan. Doc Holliday followed his friend. The events that followed have been told and retold so many times that it's difficult to separate fact from legend. What we know is this. On October 26, 1881, the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday confronted a group of cowboys near the OK Corral. The gunfight lasted approximately 30 seconds. When it was over, 3 men were dead: Tom McClory, Frank McClory, and Billy Clanton. Virgil and Morgan Earp were wounded. Doc Holliday had been grazed by a bullet. It was, in terms of actual deaths, a minor incident. Frontier towns saw far worse. But the gunfight at the OK Corral would become the most famous shootout in American history, and Doc Holliday would become a legend. The irony was not lost on those who knew him. Here was a man who should have been dead years ago, a man whose lungs were slowly filling with the bacilli of tuberculosis, a man who coughed blood into handkerchiefs every day of his life. And he had walked into a gunfight and walked out alive. But the tuberculosis that had driven him west in the first place was a more persistent enemy than any outlaw. Through all his adventures, the gambling, the gunfights, the long nights in frontier saloons, the cough remained. The fever came and went. The disease that had already taken his mother was slowly, inexorably, claiming him as well. After the gunfight at the OK Corral, violence followed the Earps and Holliday. Virgil Earp was ambushed and crippled. Morgan Earp was assassinated while playing billiards. Wyatt launched a vendetta ride that left several men dead. Through it all, Doc Holliday rode alongside his friend, coughing between gunfights. Eventually the violence subsided. Wyatt Earp moved on to California, to Alaska, to the various ventures that would occupy his remaining decades. Doc Holliday drifted through the mining towns of Colorado, Leadville, high in the mountains, Denver, with its growing population of health seekers. He moved restlessly, perhaps hoping that one more change of scenery would give him relief. But there was no relief to be found. The disease had progressed too far. The 15 years since his diagnosis had been a gift. Most consumptives died within months, but the gift was running out. By the spring of 1887, the situation was dire. The long winters and high altitude of Leadville, over 10,000 feet above sea level, had taken their toll on his already emaciated body. The thin air that was supposed to heal consumptives was now too thin for his damaged lungs to process. He needed something more. Holliday had heard of the hot springs at Glenwood Springs, a small town in western Colorado nestled in a valley at the confluence of the Colorado and Roaring Fork rivers. The waters were said to have healing properties. Native Americans had bathed in them for generations. The Ute people considered the springs sacred, imbued with the power to cure. Perhaps one more desperate hope. The springs might provide some relief. Perhaps the vapor caves, filled with the steam rising from the hot mineral waters, might ease his tortured lungs. He arrived in Glenwood Springs in the spring of 1887. He checked into the Hotel Glenwood, a modest establishment near the springs. Kate Horany, the woman known as Big Nose Kate, who had been his companion on and off for years, later claimed that she attended to him in his final days. He was 36 years old and he knew he was dying. Holliday spent the last 57 days of his life in that Colorado town. He visited the springs when he could walk. He soaked in the warm mineral waters. He breathed the steam of the vapor caves, hoping that the Indian medicine might accomplish what Western medicine could not. He played cards when he had the strength. Old habits die hard, even when the gambler is dying. He drank whiskey, which at least dulled the pain and the cough that never stopped. As the weeks passed, his condition deteriorated. He grew weaker. The cough became more constant. He spent more and more time in bed, too exhausted to make the walk to the springs. On November the 8th, 1887, the end came. According to the stories that have come down to us, Holliday was lying in bed at the Hotel Glenwood when he asked for a glass of whiskey. Someone, perhaps Kate, perhaps a hotel employee, brought it to him. He drank it, apparently with satisfaction. It may have been his last drink. It was certainly one of thousands he had consumed in his short, violent, remarkable life. Then he looked down at his bare feet sticking out from under the blankets. "This is funny," he said. And he died. The meaning of those last words has been debated ever since. Most historians believe that Doc Holliday, the gunfighter who had faced down outlaws and lawmen, who had walked into the OK Corral expecting death, who had lived for 15 years with a disease that should have killed him in months, had always assumed he would die with his boots on. In a gunfight, probably, or in some violent confrontation at a gambling table, or perhaps on the run from the law, shot down by a deputy in some dusty frontier town. That was how men like Doc Holliday died. To die in bed, of consumption, with bare feet, After all the violence, after all the near misses, after all the times he had cheated death at the hands of men, to be killed not by a bullet, but by a bacillus. It must have seemed absurd, funny even. The Glenwood Springs Ute Chief newspaper wrote in its obituary that Holliday had been baptized in the Catholic Church shortly before his death. This was based on correspondence between Holliday and his cousin, Sister Mary Melanie, a Catholic nun. No baptismal record has ever been found, but the story persists. The idea that the notorious gunfighter found religion at the end. Doc Holliday was buried in Linwood Cemetery, on a hillside overlooking the town of Glenwood Springs. The exact location of his grave is unknown. The records were lost or never kept. Somewhere on that hillside, unmarked, lies one more consumptive who came west hoping for a cure. An obelisk now marks the general area. A plaque reads, "This memorial is dedicated to Doc Holliday, who is buried someplace in this cemetery." It is a fittingly uncertain monument to a man whose life was full of legends and whose death was oddly peaceful. Tourists hike up the trail to see where the famous gunfighter rests. They take photographs by the obelisk. They imagine the thin, coughing man looking down at his bare feet and finding it funny. Wyatt Earp did not learn of his friend's death until 2 months after it happened. The news reached him eventually, as news did in those days before telephones. The man who had saved his life in Dodge City, who had stood beside him at the OK Corral, who had ridden with him on the Vendetta ride, that man was gone. Wyatt Earp would live until 1929, dying in his bed in Los Angeles at age 80. He spent his final years consulting on Hollywood westerns, trying to set the record straight about what had really happened in Tombstone. Doc Holliday had no such opportunity. The disease that had chased him across the West, that had transformed him from a dentist into a legend, had finally caught up with him. He was 36 years old, which was, for a consumptive in the 1880s, a remarkably long life. Not all of Colorado's famous longers died of the disease. Some not only survived but thrived, and left their mark on the very landscape of the state. Robert Walter Speer was born in Pennsylvania in 1855, the son of a farmer. Like so many families of the era, the Speers were touched by tuberculosis, the disease that seemed to spare no household, no social class, no corner of America. In 1877, Robert's sister Margaret fell severely ill with consumption. The family, desperate, made the difficult decision to send her to Colorado for treatment. She was following a path that thousands had already taken, hoping that the mountain air might accomplish what Eastern doctors could not. It soon became clear that Robert himself had also contracted tuberculosis. He was 22 years old when he suffered a severe lung hemorrhage, the terrifying moment when the cough produces not just blood-streaked sputum, but actual blood, bright arterial red, filling the handkerchief, filling the mouth. In 1878, Robert Speer followed his sister westward. But rather than checking into a sanatorium, rather than taking the rest cure that most physicians prescribed, Speer did something different. He went into the mountains, high into the mountains, and found work on a ranch, hard physical labour in the open air at altitude. It was unconventional. Most consumptives were told to rest, to conserve their strength, to avoid exertion. The sanatoria prescribed carefully regulated activity, gentle walks, never too strenuous, always with periods of rest. The idea of a tuberculosis patient doing ranch work, hauling hay, mending fences, riding horses, would have struck most physicians as dangerous. But it worked. Slowly, Robert Speer's health improved. The cough lessened. The hemorrhages stopped. The weight he had lost began to return. Whether it was the altitude, the exercise, the outdoor air, or simply the luck of a constitution strong enough to fight off the disease he never knew. What he knew was that the mountains had saved his life. Speer always credited that mountain ranch with his survival. For the rest of his life, he advocated for fresh air, outdoor activity, and the healing power of the Colorado climate. He had experienced it himself. He was living proof. With his health restored, Speer moved to Denver. He took a job at the Daniels and Fisher department store, a prestigious position for a young man on the rise. From there, he launched a career in real estate, then in Democratic Party politics. The former invalid was becoming a power broker. In 1904, Robert Speer was elected mayor of Denver. He would serve 2 terms, from 1904 to 1912, and then win election to a 3rd term in 1916. The former Longer, the man who had come to Colorado expecting to die, became one of the most consequential mayors in the city's history. Robert Speer had seen the future of American cities, and it looked like Chicago. In 1893, Speer had attended the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the great World's Fair that introduced millions of Americans to the possibilities of urban planning. The fair's centerpiece was the White City, a collection of neoclassical buildings arranged around grand plazas and reflecting pools. It was elegant, orderly, beautiful, everything that the crowded industrial cities of the era were not. Speer was entranced. He saw in the White City a vision of what Denver might become. Not a dusty frontier town, not a mining camp grown large, but a Paris on the Platte. A city of parks and boulevards, of monuments and fountains, of civic grandeur. When he became mayor, Speer set about making that vision real. The movement he championed was called City Beautiful, a nationwide effort to transform American cities through comprehensive urban planning. City Beautiful advocates believed that beautiful surroundings would produce better citizens, that parks and monuments would inspire civic pride and moral improvement. For Speer, there was also a personal dimension. He knew what fresh air and open spaces had done for his own health. The parks he built were not merely decorative, they were therapeutic. They were the city's lungs, bringing clean air into neighborhoods that might otherwise have been as congested as the tenements of New York. Under Speer's leadership, Denver doubled its park acreage in just 8 years. He built Civic Center Park, the green heart of downtown Denver, surrounded by the state capitol, the city and county building, and the Denver Art Museum. He cleaned up Cherry Creek, which had become virtually an open sewer, channeling it and creating parkland along its banks. He built the City Auditorium. He planted trees along the major streets. He created the boulevard that today bears his name, Speer Boulevard, running along Cherry Creek through the center of the city. Speer was not without his critics. He was accused of corruption, of awarding contracts to his friends, of running a political machine. Some of the accusations were probably true. He was a product of his era, and urban politics in the early 20th century was rarely clean. But his impact on Denver was undeniable. The city he left behind was fundamentally different from the city he had found. Greener, grander, more beautiful. Robert Speer died on May 14, 1918. During the global influenza pandemic that would kill more people than the recently concluded World War. The cause was double pneumonia, an ironic echo of the tuberculosis that had almost killed him 4 decades earlier. At least 10,000 people attended his funeral. He was the first mayor of Denver to die while serving in office. The city he had helped build mourned the Lunger who had stayed, who had survived, who had transformed a frontier town into a metropolis. Today, if you walk through Civic Center Park, past the fountains and the monuments, you're walking through Robert Speer's vision. The former consumptive who came to Colorado expecting to die left behind a city that will long outlive him. The impact of tuberculosis on Colorado went far beyond the hospitals and sanatoria. It shaped the very architecture of the state, the design of ordinary homes that still stand today. If you walk through certain Denver neighborhoods, Montclair for instance, you will notice something distinctive about the older houses. Many have dual porches on the side, open or only lightly enclosed. The floor plans are unusually open, with good airflow between rooms. The windows are large, designed to let in maximum light and air. These are TB houses. Designed specifically for families with tuberculosis patients, these homes reflected the medical wisdom of the era. Fresh air and sunshine were essential for treatment. A consumptive needed to sleep outdoors, or as close to outdoors as possible. The theory behind this was straightforward. Doctors believed that the tuberculosis bacillus thrived in stagnant, humid air, the kind found in the cramped tenements of eastern cities. Fresh, dry air, constantly circulating, would dilute the concentration of bacteria. Cold air in particular was thought to invigorate the lungs and strengthen the body's natural defences. And so the sleeping porch was born. These were not the decorative porches found on southern mansions, designed for afternoon lemonade and social visits. Colorado sleeping porches were utilitarian, screened enclosures, usually on the second floor, equipped with beds and heavy blankets. Patients would sleep there year-round in all weather. In summer, the experience was pleasant enough. Cool mountain breezes, the scent of pine, the stars visible through the screens. But in winter, sleeping outdoors in Colorado took a peculiar kind of courage. The temperatures could drop well below zero. Patients would pile on blankets, 4, 5, 6 layers deep. They would wear woolen caps and mittens to bed. Their breath would freeze in the air above them, and yet they slept there, night after night, because their doctors had told them it was the only way. Some sanatoria took this principle to an extreme. At Gardiner Sanatorium in Colorado Springs, patients were wheeled onto open-air porches even during snowstorms. The theory was that if fresh air was good, more fresh air was better, and the freshest air of all was cold winter air laden with snow. The patients wrapped themselves in blankets until only their faces were visible. Snow would accumulate on their blankets while they slept. In the morning, they would brush off the snow and, if they were still able, walk inside for breakfast. It sounds torturous, and yet many patients reported feeling better after sleeping in the cold. Whether this was the effect of the fresh air or simply the psychological benefit of doing something, of taking action against a disease that otherwise left them helpless, is impossible to say. The sleeping porch became a distinctive feature of Colorado architecture. While homes across America had porches for sitting, Colorado homes had porches for sleeping, screened enclosures where patients could spend the night breathing mountain air even in winter. Builders adapted their designs to accommodate the needs of the tuberculosis patients who comprise so much of their clientele. Houses were oriented to maximize southern exposure, ensuring that sleeping porches received the maximum amount of sunshine. Windows were designed to open wide, allowing cross-ventilation. Floor plans were made more open, reducing the number of small enclosed spaces where air might become stagnant. One remarkable structure from this era was the Molkery, built in 1888 by a German immigrant named Baron Walter von Richthofen, a distant relative of the famous Red Baron of World War I. Located in the Montclair neighborhood, the Molkery served as a dairy barn, restaurant, hotel, and tuberculosis treatment facility. The Baron was a remarkable character in his own right. He had served as an officer in the Prussian army before emigrating to America, where he made his fortune in real estate development. He saw in Colorado's tuberculosis trade an opportunity, and he designed the Molkery to capitalize on it. The treatment offered was the traditional German milk cure. Patients, called chasers by the locals because they were chasing the cure, would lounge on sun porches, drink mugs of fresh milk from the Baron's dairy cows, and breathe the supposedly health-restoring air. The idea was that the rich nutrients in fresh milk would help patients regain the weight they had lost to consumption. Combined with the fresh air and sunshine, the milk cure was believed to offer the best chance of recovery. Whether it actually worked is debatable, but the Mulcry thrived for several years, attracting patients from across the country. The Baron had created not just a treatment facility but an experience, a taste of old-world elegance in the shadow of the Rockies. The Mulcry operated until 1893. Today it houses a civic organisation, but its distinctive architecture, designed around the needs of tuberculosis patients, remains visible. The sleeping porch faded from popularity in the mid-20th century, replaced by air conditioning and antibiotics. But many of the old porches remain, enclosed now for year-round use, their original purpose forgotten. If you look carefully at older homes in Denver's historic neighborhoods, you can still spot them. Those second-floor additions with their distinctive banks of windows, their odd proportions, their suggestion of outdoor living, they are the architectural fingerprints of an epidemic. Perhaps the most distinctive architectural legacy of the tuberculosis era can be found in Colorado Springs, where strange octagonal structures dot the landscape, in backyards, at hospitals, in parks. These are Gardiner huts, named for their designer, Dr. Charles Fox Gardiner, and they represent one of the most innovative and poignant approaches to tuberculosis treatment. Dr. Gardiner was himself a health seeker. Born in the East, he had contracted tuberculosis and come to Colorado Springs in search of relief. The mountain air served him well. He recovered sufficiently to attend medical school and eventually became a practicing physician in the very city that had saved his life. He understood from personal experience what tuberculosis patients needed. They needed air, they needed isolation, and they needed dignity, some sense of having their own space, their own home, even as they fought a disease that might well kill them. Dr. Gardiner developed his design in the early 1900s, inspired by the shelters used by the Ute tribe, who had lived in the region for centuries. The Utes had survived Colorado winters in shelters that were open to the elements yet surprisingly livable. Gardiner adapted their wisdom for a medical purpose. His huts were deceptively simple: an octagonal wooden floor, a canvas tent stretched over a wooden frame, with a conical roof that came to a point at the top. The octagonal shape was not merely decorative, it allowed for efficient airflow from all directions and made the structure more resistant to the high winds that swept down from the mountains. What made the design effective was the ventilation. The canvas walls were fastened 1 inch away from the floor, allowing a constant flow of fresh air at ground level. An opening at the apex let stale air escape. The patient inside was essentially living outdoors, exposed to the elements, breathing the cold mountain air day and night. Each hut was designed for a single patient. They were small, perhaps 10 feet across, but surprisingly well equipped. Many had electric lights, a luxury in the early 20th century. Small wood stoves provided heat for the coldest nights, though patients were encouraged to keep them low. The goal was cold air, not warmth. The huts contained a bed, chairs, a small dresser, and a system for calling nurses, often a bell or a flag that could be raised to signal distress. Patients decorated their huts with photographs, books, letters from home. These tiny shelters became their world. The idea was isolation. The patient was separated from other patients, reducing the risk of spreading the disease. Each cough, each expectoration, each exhaled breath remained within that patient's own space. and the constant exposure to fresh air was believed to be the best treatment available. There was also a psychological element. In the crowded sanatorium wards, patients were constantly reminded of their illness, by the coughs of their neighbours, by the empty beds of those who had died, by the pervasive sense of disease. In a Gardiner hut, alone with the wind and the sky, a patient might almost forget that they were sick. Almost. Sanatoria across Colorado adopted the Gardiner hut design. The modern woodmen of America Sanatorium, located northwest of Colorado Springs in Woodman Valley, had nearly 250 of these octagonal structures arranged in neat rows, a small city of the dying, each patient in their own canvas shelter. The Modern Woodmen of America was a fraternal organization, a kind of mutual aid society that provided insurance and benefits to its members. When tuberculosis struck the families of woodmen, the organization established its own sanatorium to care for them. At its peak, the facility could accommodate 400 patients. From above, the rows of huts must have looked like a military encampment, or perhaps a village from some strange fairy tale. Each hut had its own small porch, its own patch of ground. Patients might wave to their neighbours across the way, exchange books or newspapers, compare symptoms and treatments. But at night, each patient was alone with the wind and the cold and the stars and the disease that was slowly claiming them. Patients might live in these huts for months or years. Some recovered, others died. The hut was home and hospital, and for many a final resting place. When a patient died, the hut would be cleaned, the bedding burned, and a new patient would move in, hoping for a different outcome. The turnover was constant. New patients arriving, old patients departing, some to resume their lives, most to be buried in the sanatorium cemetery. When the sanatoria closed in the 1940s and 50s, made obsolete by antibiotics that could actually cure tuberculosis, they faced a practical problem: what to do with hundreds of octagonal huts. The sanatorium buildings themselves could be repurposed. They became hospitals, schools, office buildings. But the huts, those strange little canvas shelters that had housed the dying, seemed to have no obvious use. The answer, in the end, was simple: sell them. Residents and businesses across Colorado Springs purchased the former tuberculosis huts. They were sturdy structures after all. The wooden floors and frames had been built to last, and the octagonal design was charming in its way. People converted them to storage sheds, garden houses, art studios, playhouses for children. The canvas walls, of course, were gone, replaced with more durable materials, but the distinctive octagonal shape remained, unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Today, if you know where to look, you can find these huts scattered across the city. They appear in the most unexpected places, in backyards, in parking lots, alongside hiking trails. They have been painted, decorated, modified beyond recognition, but their bones remain the same. That octagonal floor, that peaked roof, that peculiar geometry of survival. One is on permanent display at the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum, preserved in something close to its original state. Visitors can step inside and see how patients lived. The small bed, the sparse furnishings, the canvas walls that offered so little protection from the elements. It is a sobering experience, standing in that tiny space and imagining months or years of confinement. Another has been converted into a small visitor centre at Rockledge Ranch, a living history farm on the outskirts of town. Two in Manitou Springs have become storage sheds, their medical history forgotten by their current owners. One, remarkably, has been transformed into a small cafe, serving coffee and pastries in a space that once housed the dying. At Penrose Hospital, itself the successor to the Glockner Tuberculosis Sanatorium, A hut stands in Marjorie Reed Memorial Park, preserved as a memorial to the era. A plaque explains its history to visitors who might otherwise walk past without a second glance. Some huts have been lost entirely, demolished, burned, left to decay. Others survive in such altered form that their origins are unrecognisable. But enough remain that a dedicated explorer can still map the tuberculosis era across the Colorado Springs landscape. It is a strange afterlife for these structures. Built to house the dying, they now hold gardening tools and lawn furniture. The disease that created them has been conquered, but the huts remain, quaint, elfin, oddly cheerful reminders of a time when architecture itself was pressed into service against an invisible enemy. If walls could speak, these octagonal walls would have stories to tell. Stories of hope and despair, of recovery and death, of human beings fighting for life in tiny canvas shelters under the Colorado sky. The architectural innovations developed for tuberculosis treatment did not remain confined to sanatoria. They spread into mainstream design, influencing the way Americans thought about homes and health. The sleeping porch, developed for consumptives, became a standard feature of American homes in the 1910s and 20s. Real estate advertisements touted sleeping porches as signs of modern, healthful living. Sleep in the open air, the advertisements urged. Your body craves fresh air. Families who had no connection to tuberculosis found themselves sleeping outdoors on screened porches, breathing the night air. The practice was particularly popular in the summer months, when the alternative was suffocating in bedrooms without air conditioning. But some enthusiasts slept outdoors year-round, bundled in blankets, convinced that the fresh air would keep them healthy. This was the tuberculosis treatment, democratized. The same regimen that doctors prescribe for consumptives, fresh air, plenty of rest, exposure to the elements, became a lifestyle choice for the healthy. It was preventive medicine, the logic went. If fresh air could help the sick, surely it could keep the well from becoming sick in the first place. The emphasis on sunlight and ventilation also shaped early modernist architecture. The flat roofs and large windows that became hallmarks of 20th century design had their origins, in part, in the sanatorium, buildings designed to maximize patients' exposure to sun and air. Architects like Le Corbusier explicitly drew on sanatorium design in developing their modernist visions. The Villa Savoy, one of the most famous houses of the 20th century, features a solarium on the roof, a direct descendant of the cure porches where tuberculosis patients had once reclined. The ribbon windows, the open floor plans, the emphasis on light and air, all of these can be traced back to the architectural experiments of the tuberculosis era. The connection was not accidental. Many early modernist architects had personal experience with tuberculosis. Some had been patients themselves. Others had designed sanatoria before moving on to other commissions. The lessons they learned about ventilation, about sunlight, about the relationship between architecture and health informed everything they built afterward. Even the hospital design of today owes something to the tuberculosis era. The spacious patient rooms, the large windows, the attention to air quality, all of these features were pioneered in sanatoria where fresh air was believed to be the only cure. Before the tuberculosis era, hospitals were dark, cramped, poorly ventilated places. The very word hospital carried connotations of death and suffering. Patients avoided them when possible, preferring to be treated and to die at home. The sanatorium changed that. These were light-filled, airy, even beautiful buildings. They were designed not merely to treat disease but to promote healing, to create an environment in which recovery seemed possible. When the antibiotic era arrived and tuberculosis could actually be cured, the lessons of the sanatorium were applied to general hospital design. Walk through any modern hospital. Notice the large windows, the natural light, the attention to airflow. Notice the private or semi-private rooms designed to give patients some sense of personal space. Notice the gardens and courtyards, the outdoor spaces where patients can sit in the sun. All of this traces back, directly or indirectly, to the tuberculosis sanatoria of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The mountain air of Colorado may not have cured tuberculosis, but the architecture that sprang from that desperate hope has shaped the way we design healing spaces to this day. When we walk through a modern hospital surrounded by glass and light, we are walking through a space shaped by the tuberculosis epidemic. The ghosts of the lungers walk with us. At first, Colorado welcomed the lungers. They were, after all, paying customers. They filled the hotels. They patronized the shops. They brought money from the east and spent it in the west. The economics was straightforward. A tuberculosis patient who came to Colorado for treatment might spend months or years in the state, paying for lodging, food, medical care, and entertainment. They were, in a sense, the ideal tourist, one who stayed indefinitely and spent continuously. Early tuberculosis sufferers were among the state's champions. They praised the climate to anyone who would listen. They wrote letters home encouraging others to make the journey. Some, like Robert Speer, recovered and became prominent citizens. Others, even those who did not recover, contributed to the economy until their final days. The boosters were enthusiastic. Colorado had something that no other state could offer: the combination of altitude, dryness, and sunshine that Eastern doctors prescribed for their consumptive patients. This was a natural resource like silver or gold waiting to be exploited. And so the advertisements went out. Colorado, the health paradise. Breathe the pure mountain air. Nature's cure for consumption. The state marketed itself as a destination for the dying, a place where the hopeless might find hope. The lungers came by the thousands. They filled the hotels, they rented rooms in private homes, they set up tents on the outskirts of town. And Colorado welcomed them, their coughs, their fevers, their money. But by the late 1890s, attitudes were beginning to shift. The turning point was germ theory. Throughout most of the 19th century, tuberculosis was believed to be hereditary, a constitutional weakness that ran in families. This theory, however wrong, at least had the virtue of making patients seem unthreatening. If tuberculosis was inherited, it could not be caught. Then came Robert Koch's discovery in 1882. Tuberculosis was caused by a bacterium. It was contagious. It could be spread from person to person through coughing, through sputum, through the very breath of the infected. Koch demonstrated his findings in Berlin, presenting slides of the rod-shaped bacteria he had isolated from the lungs of tuberculosis patients. Within a year, his discovery was confirmed by laboratories around the world. The truth was undeniable. Tuberculosis was infectious. The news spread slowly at first. Many physicians resisted the new theory, preferring the older explanations they had learned in medical school. But by the 1890s, the implications were becoming clear to both doctors and laypeople. Every cough from a lunger might contain millions of bacteria. Every handkerchief might be a source of infection. Every spittoon, every piece of shared crockery, every common space where consumptives gathered, all of these could be transmission vectors. The health seekers who had seemed harmless, even admirable in their courage, now seemed dangerous. They were not merely sick, they were contagious. They were walking, coughing carriers of a deadly disease. Colorado officials began to worry. What if the state's healthy residents became infected? What if the cure for some became the death sentence for others? The very policy that had built the state's economy, welcoming tuberculosis patients, now seemed like a terrible mistake. By the first decade of the 20th century, the welcome had turned cold. State officials began discouraging tuberculosis patients from coming to Colorado, at least certain kinds of tuberculosis patients. Those with early-stage disease, who had money for treatment and a reasonable chance of recovery, were still tolerated. The wealthy consumptive, the kind who could afford Cragmore or a private sanatorium, remained welcome, their money still spent the same, regardless of their disease. But those with advanced or incurable forms of tuberculosis were told to stay away. State health officials issued warnings: do not come to Colorado unless you have sufficient funds for at least 1 year of treatment. Do not come unless you have a letter from an Eastern physician confirming that you are in the early stages of the disease. Do not come if you are already dying. The message was clear: we want your money, but not your corpses. The change was not subtle. Innkeepers who had once competed for the lucrative tuberculosis trade now refused to rent rooms to obviously sick visitors. The cough that had once signalled a paying customer now signalled a dangerous infection. Shop owners asked coughing customers to leave. Landlords included clauses in leases prohibiting consumptive tenants. The hotels were particularly zealous. A tuberculosis patient who died in a hotel room was bad for business. Other guests would hear of it. They would refuse to stay in that room, perhaps refuse to stay in the hotel at all. The value of the property would decline. Better to refuse the consumptive at the door than to deal with the consequences of their death. The stigma extended to the newspapers. "Two brothers are insane," screamed one 1906 headline in the Denver Post, describing two victims of the White Plague who had come from Cincinnati, lived in a tent and grown increasingly ill. The story treated them not as patients deserving sympathy, but as problems to be solved. Other headlines were equally harsh. "Dying consumptive found in park." "Lunger arrested for begging." "Health seekers become public burden." The newspapers that had once celebrated Colorado's healing climate now wrote of tuberculosis patients as if they were criminals. In the Colorado legislature, some representatives proposed a remarkable measure, requiring tuberculosis patients to wear bells around their necks, like lepers in medieval Europe, so that healthy citizens could avoid them. The image is almost medieval. Patients shuffling through the streets of Denver, bells tinkling with every step, warning the healthy to keep their distance. It was public humiliation dressed up as public health. The proposal did not pass, but the fact that it was seriously debated, that elected officials stood before their colleagues and argued for this measure, tells us something about how dramatically attitudes had changed. Other proposals were more successful. Spitting in public places was outlawed in many Colorado cities. This was, in fact, a sensible public health measure. The tuberculosis bacillus could survive for weeks in dried sputum, but the laws were enforced selectively. A healthy businessman who spat on the sidewalk might receive a warning. A consumptive who did the same might be arrested. During the Great Depression, the hostility intensified. The legislature passed a law prohibiting non-residents from receiving public assistance for tuberculosis treatment. If you came to Colorado sick and poor, the state would not help you. You could die in the streets, but you could not claim a dime from the state treasury. The sanatoria themselves were increasingly built on the outskirts of town. Cities wanted the economic benefits of the tuberculosis industry, the jobs for nurses and orderlies and cooks, the money spent on supplies and services, the business generated by visiting family members, but they wanted the actual patients kept at a safe distance, out of sight, out of cough. The modern Woodman of America Sanatorium, with its hundreds of Gardiner huts, was located miles from downtown Colorado Springs. Cragmore was built on a bluff north of the city, separated from the main population by geography. The message was unmistakable. We will treat you, but we do not want to see you. For the poor Lungas, those who had come west with nothing but hope, the discrimination was devastating. They had sold everything to buy their train tickets. They had liquidated their savings, mortgaged their homes, borrowed from relatives who expected never to see them again. They had said goodbye to families they might never see again, and when they arrived in the promised land, they found that no one wanted them. The advertisements had promised healing, the doctors had promised hope, but no one had mentioned what would happen if they arrived without money. Some ended up in the tent colonies that dotted the outskirts of Denver and Colorado Springs. These were not the orderly rows of Gardiner huts at the proper sanatoria. They were makeshift camps, canvas tents on wooden platforms, exposed to the elements, with little in the way of medical care or sanitation. The locals called these areas Lungas Row. They were not hard to find. Just follow the sound of coughing, the sight of emaciated figures wrapped in blankets, the smell of illness. These were the people that the sanatoria would not take, that the hotels would not admit, that the boarding houses would not tolerate. Life in the tent colonies was harsh. The tents leaked in the rain. They provided little protection from the cold. Food was scarce. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Patients who were too weak to care for themselves simply lay in their cots, waiting for someone to bring them water, waiting for death. Some of the tent colonies were organised by charitable organisations which provided at least minimal oversight. Others were entirely informal, just groups of desperate people who had pitched their tents in the same location because there was nowhere else to go. The mortality rate in these camps was high. Without proper nutrition, without medical attention, without even basic sanitation, the consumptives weakened quickly. Some died within weeks of arriving in Colorado. Others lingered for months, their condition worsening steadily, their hopes fading. Others had not even the resources for a tent. They slept in the streets. They slept in parks and under bridges. They begged for money on street corners, their coughs punctuating their pleas. They coughed in public spaces, spreading the disease they had come to cure. The city authorities, unsure what to do with these homeless invalids, often resorted to the only solution they could think of. They put them in jail. Not for crimes, simply for existing. Simply for being sick and poor and having nowhere else to go. The jails were not equipped to handle tuberculosis patients. There was no isolation, no fresh air, no treatment. The consumptives simply coughed in their cells, infecting other prisoners, infecting the guards, spreading the disease through the incarcerated population. It was, in a sense, the worst possible outcome for public health. Instead of treating the sick, Colorado was concentrating them in closed spaces where the disease could spread freely. The jails became incubators for tuberculosis. Some of the jailed Lungas died in their cells. Others were released when the authorities realized they were dying, sent back onto the streets to spend their final days wherever they could find shelter. A few were given train tickets back east, a cruel irony for people who had come west to escape death. It was this crisis, the spectacle of dying men and women jailed for the crime of poverty, that had motivated Francis Weisbart Jacobs to found National Jewish Hospital. Someone had to care for those whom everyone else had abandoned. None may enter who can pay, none can pay who enter. That motto was a direct response to the discrimination that the poor Lungas faced. It was an acknowledgement that the tuberculosis industry had failed the most vulnerable, that the healing climate had become a death trap for those without means. The pattern established in Colorado would repeat itself across the American West. As germ theory spread, so did discrimination against tuberculosis patients. Cities that had once advertised themselves as health destinations began closing their doors. Phoenix, Arizona, which had marketed itself as aggressively as any Colorado town, began requiring tuberculosis patients to register with the health department. Pasadena, California, banned consumptives from certain public spaces. El Paso, Texas, established zones where tuberculosis patients were forbidden to live. Hotels posted signs refusing to accept consumptive guests. The language was often blunt. No consumptives. Health seekers not welcome. TB patients must apply elsewhere. These signs hung in the lobbies of establishments that had once profited handsomely from the tuberculosis trade. Towns passed ordinances restricting where tuberculosis patients could live. They could not reside within a certain distance of schools. They could not rent rooms in certain neighborhoods. They could not, in some cases, walk on certain streets. The sick were being zoned out of public life. The irony was profound. The sick, who had been told that their only hope was to go west, found that the West did not want them. Some Lungas fought back. They formed patient advocacy groups. They wrote letters to newspapers protesting their treatment. They pointed out that many of Colorado's most prominent citizens, including Mayor Robert Speer, had themselves been health seekers. If tuberculosis patients were good enough to build the state, why were they now being cast out? But the fear was too strong. The healthy majority, convinced that every cough might bring death, were not interested in the rights of the sick. They wanted protection. And if protection meant treating the ill as pariahs, so be it. It is a bitter irony. The states that had been built by tuberculosis patients, that had welcomed them when they brought money and boosted local economies, turned on them when they became too numerous, too visible, too threatening. The disease had not changed. The treatment had not changed. The climate had not changed. What had changed was the understanding that tuberculosis was contagious, and the fear that followed from that understanding. We should not be too quick to judge. Fear of contagion is a natural human response, rooted deep in our evolutionary history. The people of Colorado in 1900 had no way to protect themselves from tuberculosis except through avoidance. There were no antibiotics. There was no vaccine. Masks, if used at all, were primitive and of uncertain effectiveness. Isolation was the only tool they had. And yet we can acknowledge the tragedy of what occurred. We can recognize that the discrimination, however understandable, inflicted real suffering on real people. We can mourn for those who came seeking hope and found only rejection. But we can still mourn for the Lungas who came west seeking a cure and found instead rejection, who had given up everything for the hope of another few years of life, only to discover that their disease made them pariahs, who had sold their homes and said goodbye to their families, only to die in tent colonies or jails far from anyone who loved them. They are buried in cemeteries across Colorado. Many of their graves are unmarked, their names forgotten. The stone markers, if there were any, have weathered away. The families who might have tended the graves were 2,000 miles away, unable to visit. They came by the tens of thousands, and many of them never went home. Their bones lie beneath Colorado soil, in plots that no one visits anymore, their stories lost to history. The mountains they came to see still rise on the western horizon. The air they came to breathe still flows down from the peaks, but they are gone. The lingers, the health seekers, the desperate and the hopeful, leaving behind only unmarked graves and the faint echo of a million coughs. Let us pause now and consider what we have witnessed tonight. We have travelled to a place built on hope and desperation. A place where the dying came by the thousands, seeking in the mountain air the cure that no medicine could provide. A place that welcomed them when they had money and rejected them when they became too numerous, too sick, too visible. We have met remarkable individuals, William Jackson Palmer, the railroad man who saw in the clear mountain air an opportunity to build an empire. Frances Wisebart Jacobs, the woman who refused to let the poor die in the streets. Doc Holliday, the gunfighter whose legend began with a cough. Robert Speer, the lunger who became a mayor and transformed a city. We have seen remarkable places. Cragmore, the palace for the dying rich, where champagne flowed and consumptives danced. The tent colonies, where the poor coughed their lives away on wooden platforms. The Gardiner huts, those strange octagonal shelters that now hold garden tools where patients once lay dying. The sleeping porches, still visible on old houses, their original purpose forgotten. Colorado in the tuberculosis era was many things at once. It was a place of genuine healing. Some patients did improve in the high, dry air, their symptoms easing, their lives extending beyond what anyone expected. It was a place of compassion. Frances Wisebart Jacobs and her hospital, treating those who had nothing, asking nothing in return. It was a place of luxury, Cragmore with its orchestras and dinner parties for the dying rich, where patients refused to surrender their dignity, even as the disease consumed them. But it was also a place of exploitation. The boosters who advertised 100% aseptic air knew they were exaggerating, knew that the mountain air could not actually cure tuberculosis, that most patients would die regardless. The sanatoria that charged $50 a week knew that most patients could not afford their services, that the poor would be left to suffer while the wealthy lounged on sun porches. The cities that built their economies on the tuberculosis trade knew that many of their customers would die, that the cemeteries would fill with the bodies of those who had come seeking life. And when the fear of contagion finally overcame the desire for profit, Colorado showed another face entirely. The lungers who had built the state, who had filled its hotels and restaurants, who had funded its hospitals and schools, who had become its mayors and businessmen, were suddenly unwelcome. The sick were stigmatized, marginalized, jailed. This is not a simple story of heroes and villains. The people of Colorado were responding to a disease they did not fully understand using the limited tools available to them. They were capable of both compassion and cruelty, sometimes simultaneously. The same city that founded National Jewish Hospital debated making patients wear bells. History rarely offers us pure heroes or pure villains. What it offers instead is the full complexity of human nature, our capacity for both grace and fear, our ability to care deeply and to exclude ruthlessly. We know now what the doctors of the 1890s did not know. The mountain air could not cure tuberculosis. This is not to say that the climate was entirely without benefit. The dry air of Colorado was genuinely healthier than the humid, polluted air of the eastern cities. Patients who left the crowded tenements for the open spaces of the West were removing themselves from constant exposure to the bacillus. They were breathing cleaner air, eating better food, getting more rest. All of these factors could in some cases give the immune system a better chance to fight the infection. And the sunshine, that constant Colorado sunshine, may have had some modest therapeutic effect. We know now that sunlight helps the body produce vitamin D, which plays a role in immune function. We know that ultraviolet light can kill bacteria on surfaces. The doctors of the era did not understand these mechanisms, but they observed that patients seemed to do better in sunny climates. But none of this could cure tuberculosis. The bacillus, once established in the lungs, continued its slow destruction regardless of altitude or climate. A patient might feel better in Colorado, a patient might live longer in Colorado, but the disease remained, biding its time, waiting for the moment when the body's defences would finally fail. The true cure came not from geography, but from science. In 1943, at Rutgers University in New Jersey, a microbiologist named Selman Waxman and his graduate student Albert Schatz isolated a compound from soil bacteria. They called it streptomycin, and when they tested it against tuberculosis, the disease that had killed millions, that had built and destroyed towns, that had sent 20,000 people a year to Colorado, the bacteria died. For the first time in human history, there was an effective treatment for tuberculosis, a drug that could actually kill the bacillus, that could save patients who would otherwise have died, that could end the scourge that had haunted humanity since the dawn of civilization. Streptomycin was not perfect. It had side effects. It did not work for all patients, but it worked often enough and well enough that the sanatorium industry collapsed almost overnight. The patients who had filled the hotels and tent colonies simply stopped coming. Why travel 2,000 miles to breathe mountain air when a pill could actually kill the disease? Why spend years lying on a cure porch when a course of antibiotics could accomplish the same thing in months? By the 1950s, other antibiotics had joined streptomycin in the fight against tuberculosis. Isoniazid, rifampicin, pyrazinamide, a whole arsenal of drugs that could attack the bacillus from multiple angles. The cure rate climbed, the death rate fell, and the sanatoria emptied. By the 1960s, most of the sanatoria had closed. Some were converted to other purposes. Cragmore became a university, Glockner became a hospital, others became resorts or office buildings. Others were simply abandoned, their cure porches empty, their patient registries closed forever. The Gardiner huts were sold off to become garden sheds and playhouses. The sleeping porches were enclosed and converted to bedrooms. The TB houses of Montclair became ordinary family homes, their original purpose forgotten by the new owners. Tuberculosis, which had shaped the very identity of Colorado, became a historical curiosity, a strange chapter in the state's past, interesting to historians and few others. The disease had not been defeated by the mountain air. It had been defeated by science, by the patient work of researchers in laboratories far from the Rockies. The cure that Colorado had promised for decades was finally delivered, but by Rutgers University, not by Pikes Peak. And yet, the legacy remains. Denver today is a thriving metropolis, one of the fastest growing cities in America, attracting hundreds of thousands of new residents every year. They come for the job opportunities, for the outdoor recreation, for the quality of life. They come, in their way, for the same things that drew the Lungers a century ago: the sunshine, the mountain air, the sense of possibility. The parks and boulevards that a former Lunger named Robert Speer built continue to define the urban landscape. Walk along Speer Boulevard, past Civic Center Park, through the green spaces that wind through the city, and you are walking through the vision of a man who came to Colorado expecting to die, and stayed to transform it. The medical industry that was born in the tuberculosis era remains a major economic driver. Denver is home to some of the nation's leading hospitals and research institutions. The doctors and nurses who work in these modern facilities are the professional descendants of the physicians who once prescribed fresh air and rest. Colorado Springs, the city that William Jackson Palmer founded as a health resort, is now known for other things. Military installations like the Air Force Academy and NORAD technology companies, tourism to Pikes Peak and Garden of the Gods. But the sanatorium buildings still stand, converted now to other purposes but still recognizable to those who know what to look for. The tuberculosis huts still dot the neighborhoods, octagonal reminders of a vanished era, housing garden tools and holiday decorations where patients once lay dying. They are strange little monuments, these huts. Most people who pass them have no idea what they are. And National Jewish Health, the hospital that Francis Weisbart Jacobs dreamed of, continues to operate on its original campus in East Denver. It is consistently ranked among the best respiratory hospitals in the nation. Its mission has expanded beyond tuberculosis to include asthma, allergies, immune disorders, and heart conditions. But its origins, as a refuge for the dying poor, funded by donations, caring for those who could not pay, remain part of its identity. The hospital's current motto is Breathing Science, but the old motto still resonates: none may enter who can pay, none can pay who enter. The 1/3 of Colorado's population that came seeking the cure left their mark on the state, in ways that persist to this day. They shaped its architecture, the sleeping porches, the open floor plans, the orientation toward the sun. They shaped its economy, the hospitals and research institutions, the tourism industry, the real estate market. They shaped its culture, the outdoor lifestyle, the emphasis on health and wellness, the very identity of Colorado as a place of renewal. They brought their money and their desperate hope, and in exchange they received, sometimes, a few more years of life. Some recovered and became pillars of their new communities. Others died quickly, barely unpacking their trunks before the disease claimed them. Most fell somewhere in between, living out their remaining days in the thin mountain air, watching the peaks change colour with the seasons. Many of them never went home. They are buried in Colorado cemeteries, in Denver and Colorado Springs, in Glenwood Springs and Leadville, in small towns throughout the state. Their names are carved on headstones that weather a little more each year. Their stories are mostly forgotten. They came from everywhere, from the tenements of New York and the row houses of Philadelphia, from the mansions of Boston and the farms of Ohio. Rich and poor, young and old, desperate and hopeful, they ended their journeys here, in the shadow of the mountains, and here they remain. What does the tuberculosis migration teach us about ourselves? Perhaps this, that human beings, faced with death, will try almost anything. They will sell their homes, they will leave their families, they will travel thousands of miles into an uncertain future. They will breathe cold mountain air through damaged lungs, hoping that geography might accomplish what medicine cannot. This is not foolish. It is profoundly human. The will to live is the most basic of instincts rooted deep in our biology, and it drives us to extraordinary efforts. We will grasp at straws. We will chase rumours of cures. We will try anything at all, if there's even the smallest chance it might work. The lungers who came to Colorado were not naive. Many of them understood that their chances were slim. They had seen friends and family die of the same disease. They knew that the mountain air was no sure cure, that many who made the journey never returned. But slim chances are still chances, and in the face of certain death, even a small hope is better than none. We should also remember the capacity for both generosity and cruelty that the tuberculosis era revealed. Francis Wise Bart Jacobs, walking through the streets of Denver, bringing food and comfort to the dying, refusing to accept that the poor should be abandoned simply because they had no money. The Colorado legislature, seriously debating whether to make patients wear bells around their necks, treating the sick as if they were lepers in medieval Europe. National Jewish Hospital, with its motto of unconditional care, refusing to charge the patients who needed help most. The hotels and boarding houses, posting signs that read, "No consumptives allowed," turning away the desperate because they feared infection. Robert Speer, the lunger who became a mayor dedicating his life to building a more beautiful city. The tent colonies, where the poor coughed their lives away because no institution would take them in. Both impulses, the generous and the fearful, live within us still. They are not separate tendencies but intertwined aspects of our nature. The same person might show compassion in one moment and cruelty in the next. The same society might build hospitals for the dying poor while debating whether to make them wear bells. When the next epidemic comes, as epidemics always do, we will face the same choices that Coloradans faced in the 1890s. How do we balance compassion with self-protection? How do we care for the sick without fearing them? How do we respond to a threat that we cannot see, cannot understand, cannot control? We have already faced these questions in our own lifetimes. The HIV epidemic of the 1980s, the SARS outbreak of 2003, the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. Each time we saw the same mix of compassion and cruelty, generosity and fear. Each time we discovered that our ancestors were not so different from ourselves. The Lungers of Colorado are distant now, a century and more removed from our own lives. But they were people like us, facing choices like ours, responding with the same complex mix of courage and fear that we bring to our own challenges. There are no easy answers. There never were. But perhaps there is wisdom in remembering, wisdom in honouring those who came before, who faced impossible choices with such limited tools, who tried to do their best even when their best was not enough. Let us return one final time to that train rolling westward across the Great Plains. The passengers sit with their one-way tickets, their coughs, their desperate hopes. The sun is setting ahead of them, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The mountains appear on the horizon, blue and distant and somehow holy. Somewhere ahead lies Denver, the world sanatorium, the place where the air will heal them. Or so they have been told. We know now what they did not know. The mountain air cannot cure tuberculosis. Some of them will improve, perhaps many more than would have survived in the crowded tenements they left behind. Some will linger for years, perhaps decades, in the thin, clear atmosphere, finding in Colorado, if not a cure, then at least a reprieve. But most of them will die, if not in weeks, then in months. If not in months, then in years. They are the lingers, 1/3 of a state's population, 20,000 a year, rolling westward with the desperate faith that geography might save them. The train chugs onward through the gathering dusk. The mountains grow closer, their peaks catching the last light of day. And somewhere in those crowded cars someone is coughing, that deep, rattling cough that speaks of lungs filling with disease. But there is hope in that car as well. There is the hope of the young man from Philadelphia who has read the advertisements and believes that the clear mountain air will restore him. There is the hope of the mother from Chicago who has brought her daughter west, praying that this new land will give her child the years that the doctors back home said she would never have. There is the hope of the businessman who has sold everything he owns to make this journey, betting his entire fortune on the chance that he might live long enough to rebuild it. There is the hope of the elderly woman who has come to Colorado not expecting to survive, but hoping that she might die in a beautiful place, surrounded by mountains and sunshine, rather than in the cramped darkness of her city apartment. Hope. That is what the Lungers carried with them, more precious than any luggage, more sustaining than any medicine. Hope that the air would heal them, hope that tomorrow would be better than today, hope that death, if it came, would be gentle. They came seeking life. They found in the end what we all find, the limited span of years that fortune allows us, spent in whatever place seems kindest. Some found peace in Colorado, some found suffering, most found something in between, a mixture of good days and bad, of sunrises over the mountains and long nights of coughing, of friendships formed in sanatorium wards and losses that could never be replaced. They were, in the end, simply human. They faced their mortality with whatever courage they could muster. They lived their remaining days as fully as they were able, and when the end came, they went gently into whatever lies beyond, their last breaths drawn in the thin, clear air that had drawn them west. And so, as the night deepens and the mountain wind fades into memory, we leave Colorado behind for now. But its legacy remains, in the parks that a Lunga built, in the hospital that compassion created, in the octagonal huts that now hold garden tools where the dying once lay, in the sleeping porches of old houses, in the cemeteries that dot the landscape, in the very soil of this mountain state. The mountains still rise as they have risen for millennia. The air is still thin and clear. The sun still shines 300 days a year. Colorado remains a place of healing, even if the disease it once promised to cure has been conquered by other means. Next time on the Sanatorium, we'll explore another dimension of tuberculosis history, but that journey is for another night. For now, rest well. Let the ghost of mountain air carry you gently into sleep. Imagine yourself on one of those old cure porches, wrapped in blankets, gazing up at the stars that seem so close at this altitude. Feel the cold air on your face. Hear the distant wind in the pines. The peaks stand eternal, their snows unchanged, their promise of healing as old as the hills themselves. They watch the Lungas come, they watch the Lungas die, and they will remain long after we, too, have passed. If you found some measure of peace in tonight's journey, perhaps leave a like or share it with someone who might need it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for remembering the Lungas with us, those thousands upon thousands of desperate, hopeful souls who came west seeking life. Good night.